Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the session, We That Are Young, Dreams in Dystopia. We're here to discuss two brilliant debut novels by Preti Taneja and Prayaag Akbar today. We're going to start with some short readings and then go into conversations, and the last 15 minutes will be a question and answer with the audience. I'm going to give a brief introduction before we begin. Preti Taneja is a writer and human rights activist. She's broadcaster for the BBC on human rights and world culture. Her debut novel, We That Are Young, has been called one of the most exquisite and original novels of the year by the Sunday Times. It's been featured as one of the top 10 novels in The Hindu, The Guardian, and has been called a masterpiece by The Spectator. Prayaag Akbar is a Mumbai-based writer and journalist. His critically acclaimed first novel, Leila, was published in India in 2017 and was the first book to be published by Simon & Schuster India. He's currently a consulting editor at Mint. Thanks so much, Preti and Prayaag, for being here. I'm going to go back to the title of the session, Dreams in Dystopia, and tell you a little bit about the two books before we do the readings to give you a flavor of the writers, just the style of writing. On one hand, we have Preti's We That Are Young, where she has transposed the well-known Shakespearean tragedy, King Lear, to a contemporary business family in India. The king has turned into an unstoppable business tycoon in India called Devraj Bapuji, who has to pass on his business empire to his three daughters. On the other hand, we have a dystopian vision of an Indian city set against the backdrop of a mother's search for her daughter. And while both books are extremely different in the genres that they are, they're both extremely unforgiving in the kind of critique that they present of the times that we live in. So I'm going to hand over to Preti to start reading her novel, and then we'll go into some questions and answers. Thanks, Preti.
Close to the mic, right? Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's Monday, so I don't know where you all should be, but I'm very glad that you're here. I want to introduce you to two of my 5 characters. The book is told in these 5 sections, and there are 3 daughters and 2 sons, and they're a kind of group of friends. I'm going to start with Gargi, who is Devraj Bapuji's oldest daughter, and she, if you know King Lear, is the Goneril figure of that play. And in my novel, she's very different to the Goneril that you might think you know, who's a very archetypal evil daughter. She's standing in a moment of change in her life, where finally she's about to take her place in the company that her father built. She is glad to get out, though it is already so hot that the air has turned liquid and the earth seems to waver, as if the world cannot decide what to be. She is Gargi Devraj Grover, granddaughter, wife, sister. She is Gargi Devraj Grover, daughter, acting chairman of the Devraj Company, custodian of the key to her father's office. A polygonal space on the 18th floor of a gleaming obsidian shard-like building, a space to which she, this bright early morning, is going alone and for the first time, with a key in her hand. She is custodian, the word fits. For though the company headquarters was built in the 1970s, the key is satisfyingly long, heavy, ornate. It might have fallen straight out of one of the classics Gargi read as a girl. David Copperfield, Vanity Fair. Under the covers with a torch at night, in the morning when she should have been going for a bath, she stole time for herself, disguised by the sound of water splashing from the nalka onto the tiles. Sitting on the pot, she would read, her smell, a slight tang from between her legs, the overripe sweetness of her sweat, rising around her while she put off the shame of touching her body to clean it, of allowing her dirtiness to wash down the drain to the street, spewing into the poor, stinking Yamuna, mixing with the dirt of millions. Back then, she had wanted to be the heroine of those books. What pretty names they had, evoking their bodies so fresh and so clean. Dora, Amelia, like flowers, she had thought, and asked her grandmother and sisters to only call her Rosa, since Barnaby Rudge was her favorite book once. She reflects on that time as she stands on the steps of the farmhouse, conscious of what she is leaving inside, alive to the early morning rush hour of sparrows chittering above her. Her eye falls on the sleepy gardener at the far end of the lawn. He is wheeling a barrow to pick up. What is he picking up? She cannot tell. In any case, as she waits for Satvant, her driver, to bring around the car, he is late, he is new, it is not his fault. She thinks about the heroines of her girlhood books, the straight lines of their lives from birth through school to some stumble of fate and finally fortune in finding love and marriage. Only Rosa did not have that. Her story remained unfinished, and this mystery suited Gargi, for although her reading had given her, as a girl, a trust in the turning of pages, the sense that someone, possibly her grandmother, might be writing her story too, with a sure hand towards the promised end, she had never been sure that she wanted that end at all. Okay, so the next section that I'm going to read to you, a short section, is way through the book, in the heart of what this book is really about. And it takes place when a very wealthy young man named Jeet, who is a poet, and he's a drug addict, and he's a sort of very starry, glamorous type of figure, has rejected that life, and he's come to live among the poor people of the slums. But he's gone through a terrible storm, and after that storm, he has these kinds of visions of darkness. I cannot survive on nothing. No one can. However much I try, I want. Jeet begins to sob. Bapuji rocks him gently. Shh, shh, be a good boy, Jeet thinks to himself in the basti. Say nothing, chup chup, let the rain come again. Let it wash all of life away. Rain falls in a light sheen over everything. It drips through the holes in Jeet's plastic roof. It washes his face as he tries to look up. He sees Bapuji so clearly, every line on his face, every pigment mark. The man he has worshipped all of his life is really there, looking at him with pity. Jeet thinks he says Tatvam Asi, but he cannot be sure. Then the fever takes over. Jeet remembers little after that, until night comes, the second after the storm, and Bapuji is in some new sort of frenzy. He tears at his filthy kurta, his diamond studs fall off. Jeet scrabbles for them, but Bapuji kicks them into the sewer. He rents at his shawl and drops it in the mud. Legs tremble, arms ache, but Rudra himself raises up and falls on it. He wraps it between his legs and around his hips. Nanu wakes up from her corner, a bundle of torn chiffon and sodden papier-mâché skin, as if she is waiting to be formed. She tries to stop him, calling to Bapuji not to allow a madman to wear his clothes, not to turn the world ulta-sida upar niche, risk each becoming the other. He feels Nanu's hands grab at him and slap him. His limbs twist with fever. He retreats to a corner, stroking his new covering, nursing himself. We that believe in India shining. He whispers it into his shawl. We that believe we are better than all others. We that are the youngest, the fastest, the democracy, the economy, the future technology of the world, the global superpower coming soon to a cinema near you. We, Hampanch, that are the 5 covers of the 5 great cousins of the 5 great rivers, everybody, our brother, sister, lover. We that are divine, the echo of the ancient heroes of the old times. We that fight, we that love, we that are hungry, so hungry. We that are young. We that are jigging on the brink of ruin. We that are washed in the filth of corruption. Chal, so what? Aise hota hai. We that are a force of all that is natural, slow, death to Muslims, gays, chi women in their skin tights, hi. We that sit picnicking on the edge of our crumbling civilization. We that party with shots and more shots as the world burns beneath us, as the dogs bark, as the cockroaches crow, as the old eat their young and the young whip their elders, all wearing the birth masks of respect. We that present only the shadows of ourselves behind our painted smiles. We that protest for the right to drink whiskey sours served to our beds at noon. We that eat our beef with chopsticks. We that twist tongues to suit our dear selves. We that worship the ancient religion of Lakshmi, of Shiva, of wealth creation and ultimate destruction. We that will be born strong in this life and the next life and in a party that never ends. We that are the future of this planet. We that begin with this beloved India will endure. Yes, it all belongs to us and we will eat it all. We that are India and no longer slaves. We that are young.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Preeti. Prayaag, I'll request you to, would you be using the podium as well? Okay.
So I thought I'd read it. My book has been called Dystopia. It's been called science fiction, speculative fiction. But I began writing it, when I first started writing it, I was trying to look at how a state can have this very deep impact on a family. And I was looking at a mother being separated from her daughter. So I thought I'd read a little section about this mother. When you encounter this, the narrator, Shalini, she's been separated from her daughter for 16 years. And so her daughter exists as more as a memory than as a real person. So I thought I'd read a little section that sort of captures what I feel is at the heart of this novel. When I dream about Leila, she is always in the distance, outside the light, but I know she has a warm, open face. I still see her eyes, light like my mother's, irises warm, gold-brown pools in which the sun sets ablaze, radial chips of malachite, green and faintly black. She is impatient to meet the world, my little girl grown. She is taller than me. This makes me so happy. Sometimes she's in school uniform, walking toe, heel, back arched, the proud shoulders and strong nose of all the women in our family. Today she turned 19. Desires, insecurities, angers that I know nothing of, though I must have played my part in. I would know so little about her now. Maybe her laugh. When she was an infant, I'd bring my face right to her nose and make a funny sound, whaish, and she'd squirm with delight, cackling with a deep cadent lilt. Her laughter now will carry a kernel of that. So I come to Purity 1 on her birthday to ask her for forgiveness. We didn't respect these walls, so they took her from me. 16 years. Does she wonder sometimes where I am, if I abandoned her? I've read the books, she won't remember. She was taken on her birthday, only 3 years old, so she can't remember. When I think about this, it's like I'm burning on the inside. She wouldn't know me if I crossed her on the road. To her, I am an emptiness, an ache she cannot understand but yearns to fill. No, I have left more, a glimmer at least. The blurred outline of her face, a tracery of scent, the weight of fingertips on her cheek, the warmth of her first cradle, my arms. I found a journal on early cognition in the library. One article said our first memories go back to 2 in a few months. We don't remember how things flow into each other, how they are linked, but our minds can place, in the vast fog, discrete islands. Maybe she remembers accompanying me to the mall one winter morning, white-framed sunglasses on her head, a Santa greeting the customers walking in. Leila, so thrilled by this, her shoulders began to vibrate. She squeezed my hand, still trembling, tugging gently until we stepped out of the security check line. I could see only his unfitness, thin-limbed, dark-skinned, sweating in the hard noon sun. Over the double doors, forlorn clumps of cotton glued to the lintel, peach foundation trickling down his forehead like muddy rain down a window. But Leila was transported. She ran to him, mindless of the stale, cheap Duvetine, its acrid whiff. She was laughing, and he pinched his cheek between his hairy knuckles, and he pinched her cheek between his hairy knuckles. I didn't say a word. You want a present from Santa? I finally asked. There were gift-wrapped boxes piled against the front window, clearly empty. Leila looked confused by this. Maybe she didn't know what Santa did. The suit, the beard, an image in some book come to life. This was what thrilled her. The burden of age is expectation. It leaves a judging eye. She turned to me and smiled in a lopsided way, as if suddenly aware of her excitement. And when I saw her expression, that gentle smirk, I felt her elation as if it was growing within me. Of course this place was enough. There was charm to be found here. There was nothing tacky. My baby's full beam happiness at its center, and I as innocent as her, as untroubled. All this, why do I fool myself? Leila will remember something quite different if she remembers anything at all.
Thanks so much, Prayaag, and thanks so much, Preeti. We're going to move into the conversation now. I wanted to start with you, Preeti, and first of all, congratulations on the fantastic reception of your book. Basic question, how did you think of reimagining King Lear in the Indian setting, and were there particular political incidents that triggered you to do this?
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. The idea for the book has been with me for a really long time. I was born in the UK and I grew up there, and we have to study Shakespeare at school. like everyone. And when I was doing what's the equivalent of 12 boards, I learned King Lear. And I had the most amazing English teacher who I want to pay tribute to every time I talk about this book, because without her, it would never really have opened me up to how language can be so exciting, and how a family can just be seen so clearly for all its politicking. And then I started to think about the ways in which in my family partition was talked about, and I could suddenly see in this Act 1, Scene 1 love test of King Lear that there is a sort of divide and rule going on between these three daughters, and the play opens with a partition of a kingdom and it ends with a civil war. So when we think about that in the Indian context, we have 1947 and we have the ongoing conflict in Kashmir, which I've always been fascinated by, and part of the novel is then set there.
And I think in general, Shakespearean tales have lent themselves really well into Indian settings, and we'll talk about that a bit later. I'm going to move to you and your first question. You sort of stole my line already, but you were talking about how the book has been categorized as speculative fiction, dystopian fiction, science fiction. Somewhere I read about it being even magical realism. And I think that's what's the most unnerving about Leila. It is supposed to be in this future dystopian city, but it is rooted in the now, and it is rooted in the fault lines of the present. So how do you describe your style, and just tell us a little bit about that?
I think I set out to write what I thought was quite a realist novel. I'm not a big fan of classifying fiction. I think the best books, the best writers are able to, stride across genres. They can really sort of, you play with those boundaries that I think it's useful maybe for readers and for publishers to set, to place books in certain categories. But as a writer, it's a way of, it's limiting yourself. You sort of, if you think that I'm setting out to write a speculative fiction book, or I'm setting out to write a science fiction book, it's a way of, your story is taken in a certain way, as opposed to just writing what you really want to. And I really wanted to write about, when I set out to write this book, I wanted to write about something that was troubling me very much, which is, how our cities are kind of self-segregating. And I wanted to look at how that can have this really tremendous impact. We think of it as a benign force. We think of it as something that doesn't really affect, it's okay, it's the way we've always lived, people live according to caste lines, and that's okay, that's an Indian thing. But I wanted to write about how sort of really destructive it could be if it's really allowed to unfold in the way that that is happening in cities like Bombay and Delhi now.
And about how these sort of segregations actually shape a city, or shape the infrastructure of a city.
Totally.
Yeah. And I'm going to come back to you and ask you about your research for the novel. And you've been away from India as well, but you've still managed to paint a really real picture of an Indian business family, whether it's New Delhi, whether it's Srinagar, or sorry.
It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it is amazing, and it's so vivid, and it's so sort of, it just evokes so many images. So I just wanted to know a little bit about your research. And I know that it took you about 7 years to write the novel, and there have been so many tremendous political change since then, so just how you tracked that.
Okay, so this question of how on earth I kind of managed to set a book and write about Delhi. We were at a literature festival stuffed full of excellent writers writing about Delhi and writing about India and politics, and they do it through their poetry, they do it through their non-fiction, but someone is reading that work. I mean, that's what I've been doing all of this time. That's what it's for. So, I've got these saints that I have on my bookshelf who have watched over this process for a very long time, and they include people who have been at this festival of Rashi Butalia, Guru Charan Das, P. Sainath, all of these greats of Indian literature. I mean, what are they writing for if it isn't to help us to envision our own stories and our own futures? As for my own research, on top of that reading, I spent a lot of time secreting around in different spaces at different levels of social hierarchies in countries in different parts of the world. And I'm lucky enough to have the privilege to do that, but also to try to be as under the radar as I possibly can. And that's allowed me to get into some spaces like very, very wealthy parties, or terrible, terrible poor slum areas where I've met the most incredible people. And I'm sure every woman in the audience will know that people are only too happy to explain things to you about their lives and about their stories and about those details. And you just, take it all in and write it all down.
Thank you. And I think the other thing that I wanted to ask both of you, and any of you can come in, is that both of you have had you've been reporting for so many years. You've been reporting as a human rights activist. And just that transition from that nonfiction reporting to fiction writing and how that influenced your styles, if at all, in the novels. For either of you to take up.
I think certainly my years as a reporter and editor have made their way into the book, because I think what I really enjoyed in my 20s was I got to travel around India, and I got to see a lot of India. You take trains to, I used to report a lot from Jharkhand and Bihar. I was very interested in Madhya Pradesh also. So, I got to travel and see, if you report on a local election, actually, you get to see, it's fascinating what happens, it's really India's most dynamic political stage is like your Vidhan Sabha elections. And I got to see a lot of India very close hand, and I got to see a lot of poverty, and I got to see a lot of disparity, and how comfortable we are with that kind of disparity all over the country. And so I think that kind of filtered into my writing. My novel is not about any of these things, but it kind of, these are thoughts that all registered with me.
It was a culmination of everything that
Yeah.
you've seen and gone through.
I think so, yeah. I think it was a lot of that reporting, a lot of what I saw sort of came into the book in different ways.
And
Yeah, for me, the question is like, how does the journalism inform the writing? Well, I think one of the best skills I learned as a trainee journalist is how important it is to listen. And that really helped me everywhere I go, just to take things in. And, the book is, We That Are Young, it's a social tragedy, just like King Lear. And so to be able to understand those contexts, I drew on a huge amount of reporting that I've done in various parts of the world, where I found that even in the worst of times, in the conflicts that I've covered, for example, in Jordan and Syria, with Iraqi refugees, people do want the same things. They want human connection. They want love. They want to be understood. In refugee camps, I've met women who are like, you say, oh, your life is so terrible. How are you coping? And they're like, oh, I met this guy on the boat over here, and now we're in the camp and he's not returning my calls. So there's that kind of humanness about how we connect with each other that I learned during the journalism, and I hope that that's come through in the book.
Yeah. No, it's really important to bring that experience into this writing as well. I'm going to go back to something you said about what you saw while reporting and how comfortable we have become with this kind of segregation, and I think you do bring that out in your novel. There are sectors in the city which are, Tamil Brahmin zone or Bohra Muslim zone, or things like that. And it is true. It's not something imagined actually, which is really discomforting almost. So again, was there something particular that you saw that informed the way you imagined your city, or?
Well, it was actually, I think I don't name the city in the book, but I think I've spent a lot of time in Delhi and some time in Bombay, the last 5-6 years in Bombay, and aspects of both those cities entered the book. I remember one of the first things that, in Delhi we have something called colonies. We call our neighborhoods colonies, which is, it's a strange term, you're actually talking about colonizing a little plot of land, and people put up these gates and block, the public roads then are not anymore thoroughfares. You block people from using those roads, and it always used to, it used to strike me that if you approach this colony in a car, they let you come in, but if you enter it on foot, the guards evaluate you and they see if you're upper class or middle class or lower class, and if you're lower class, they don't let you in. And so it's really, it used to, I would wonder about that. How are we allowed to do this to this little plot of land? You own a house, but then you put up these gates around this whole thing. And so this was something that stayed with me about Delhi, and I was always curious about that. And then I moved to Bombay, and I moved to live with my girlfriend at the time. Now she's my wife, and she has a Hindu last name. She's Hindu, and I remember when we were first looking for a house, she had spoken to the broker. And she sort of, she said, and her name is Rana, Shanta Rana, so the broker thought we were a Hindu couple. And he sort of took us around to all these 6 or 7 houses, and we really, these flats that we were looking for, and we liked 2 or 3, and we told him, acha, we'll take this one, or, we like this one or this one. And then I told him that I'm going to transfer the money from my account, and I told him my name, and he was shocked, his face fell, and he was like, oh no, you're a Muslim, we can't, I have to take you to a whole different set of houses. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, no, you can't live in any of those houses that I've taken you to. So, it really came as a shock. And I think, growing up with a certain amount of privilege, or you're growing up in an upper class society or upper middle class society, you tend to think that these things don't happen to you. And it really kind of hit home that these are things that, it is a reality, it's a social reality of India, that people don't care if you're, educated or accomplished or anything like that. They would want to live with people from their own caste or their own religion. And in Bombay, we have Muslim buildings and Gujarati buildings and all sorts of things like that, and they enforce all these rules about what you can eat and whether you can drink or not. And all of this, as I was writing, all of this became to matter very much to me, and it's all sort of entered the narrative.
Sort of became that obsession with purity and contamination and that.
I think that's exactly what it's about, people go through, almost every incident in the book is something that someone has told me, digging through trash to check if there's chicken bones in it, people do this kind of thing in Bombay, and it really is, it's so troubling, these rich landlords are going through a garbage dump and sort of searching to see if their tenants have eaten chicken the night before, it's crazy.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, but I agree with that, because all the incidents in my book are based on things that actually happened to me, stories people actually told me about their real lives. One almost doesn't have to try to find these absurdities. And
people call it dystopia, but I'm like, no.
No, it's here, it's now.
I think a dystopia has this kind of element of, distance, and it's it's an inversion of utopia. So I think it's a safe way of looking at the world, because you're like, when you read this book or read your book, and then people are like, it must be something in some imagined society, but it's really not. These are all things happening around us.
I think that's why things like Black Mirror or any of these dystopian, so-called dystopian shows or novels are gaining so much popularity, because it's scary because it's now. It's scary because you see it every day and it's happening every day, and it's important to bring that out. And I think now because I live in Delhi, so when I'm going on flyovers in Delhi, I can't help but think of fly roads and how the fly roads in Leila are sort of above the grime and filth of everything below, and you're just cut off from it because it's the elite, and there is something to say about access and about.
Well, when I was first thinking about the book, I was living in Delhi, and there were all these, Sheila Dikshit was building these flyovers throughout the city, and they're of course very convenient, and it's good that they're building them, and it's eased traffic in some ways, but you can get on one part of the ring road, and you're actually coasting above the city, and you're sort of going above all of this other stuff that's going below you. And I guess it stayed with me, and it turned into something else in the novel.
And in my book, those flyovers are built by that company.
Yeah, exactly.
they're a construction company.
Connection.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to you and talk about the Indian adaptations that we were talking about. I know you had a conversation about this at the festival already, but what is your take on the other Indian adaptations of Shakespeare? So there's Vishal Bhardwaj, and there's his retelling of Macbeth, Othello, Hamlet. So is there something that you
Well, I started writing We That Are Young in 2010, and I finished it in 2013. And I hadn't seen Omkar and I hadn't seen Makbul, but I knew about Vishal Bhardwaj's work, and I knew that he was thinking about doing another tragedy. And I was thinking, my God, I'm in Kashmir and I'm doing my research, and this amazing director who's got critical acclaim is going to make my story before I have time to finish my book, because he has a lot more power. But luckily for me, he chose to make Heather, which is Hamlet, and not King Lear, even though it's on the record that he was thinking about doing Lear, and I have to say I'm very relieved that he didn't, and he might now.
Thanks. I think the other thing I want to talk about is what came out in your readings, and both your books open with first-person narration, and Prayaag, as a male author, starts it, throughout the book, there is a female protagonist who's speaking in first person, and you speak through 5 different voices, but there are male voices there as well. So I wanted to comment or just talk a little bit about that gender, whatever you can call it. It's not impersonation, but just how you feel about writing from another gender. And also in your novel, gender does play a larger role, not so much in Leila, because gender in Preti's novel plays a sort of more critical role in the sense of being set in such a patriarchal kind of setting with Devraj Bapu as the patriarch and the family and the 3 daughters, inheritance, things like that. So just talk a little bit about how gender plays out in your novel.
Well, Shakespeare is a consummate player with gender, and girls become boys, boys dress up as girls, a man gets turned into a donkey in Midsummer Night's Dream, There's all sorts of play going on there about what makes us who we are. And that was really exciting for me. I had a lot of fun writing my 2 male characters. Even though they both come from places of privilege and entitlement, they both feel like outsiders in the worlds that they're in. So we have Jeevan, who's coming back to India after time in America, and he comes back with this sort of swaggering attitude that his Americanness is going to give him a higher status because obviously West is best. But he quickly realizes that India's just moved on so much without him, and he's scrabbling to catch up. So that was a really interesting thing to explore for me. Because I've come from the UK and I've seen that change when I've been coming back at different intervals. And the character that I read from, Jeet, has this position of privilege, but he's gay and he's closeted. And so for him, that secret just informs so much about why he is trying to run away from his very, very repressive society in his life. And I think understanding disenfranchisement, understanding what it feels to be an outsider is quite a human, common thing. So whether I'm writing as a man or a woman, some of those feelings come into play. I'm coming at it from a position of lack of privilege in a way, even though from the outside they seem to have everything because they have a lot of money.
I think it's interesting. I'm asked about this all the time, and I was just talking to Preeti about this right before we went on stage. But I think for a male writing in a female's voice, it is quite unusual. But Preeti doesn't get asked about this when she's a woman writing in a male's voice, and I think that's also a reflection of something about power structures in our society. But I don't think. I think there's, of course, it was a huge challenge, and it took me a long time to get Shalini's voice right, and And I was lucky to have an excellent editor who cut out parts of the novel that weren't sounding true, I think, to her as a reader, as a woman, for me writing as a woman. But I think there is something to be, I wanted to try it because for me, I was trying to write about this relationship between a mother and her daughter. And there is something, there of course very many differences between a male and a woman, between a man and a woman, but I think there's something that unites us also, there's a common human experience, and I was actually trying to capture that. Again, it's not a study of gender, my book is not a study of gender, but I was trying to write, I don't think that there is necessarily this world of difference between how a man and a woman reacts to a certain situation, to tragedy or to separation, and I think it's not an insurmountable sort of barrier. Some of the best novels I've read, Kazuo Ishiguro he's a favorite author of mine, and his first novel was Pale View of Hills, and he writes beautifully in the voice of a mother. And so when I started writing, I was kind of inspired by him.
Okay, so I'm going to come clean. My book is about gender. It's very much about gender, and it's about structural discrimination and power, and who holds the power in every situation. So, I don't agree with you. I think men and women do experience situations differently because we're caught in a social system that makes that happen. Everybody is sort of surveilling each other to keep you in check in a certain way, that you have to wear a skirt that comes down to your ankles, and you have to wear your dupatta in a certain way, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. You can't go out on the street after 9:30. I've had some really interesting experiences since I got here. One night, I was standing on the road. It was very, very busy. I think it was on Republic Day. And I met these two young women who had come all the way from Indore on their first ever trip away from home alone. They just graduated high school, and they just had never been able to leave the house as 17-year-olds without chaperones or without just everyone knowing where they were every hour of the day. And I think that is a particularly social and gendered experience, which makes you feel different about the space that you're in all of the time. And that's not okay with me. So that is something that the book really explores, the way these people surveil each other and the way they kind of try and keep each other in check. Another experience we were kind of laughing about earlier is that during the time we've been going around the festival, I've been with my husband, Ben, who's sitting over there, and people come up to us and introduce themselves to us, and they all think he's the writer. So I'm just going to leave that one with you.
No, you're right, and I think that does play out in your novel as well, whether it's in The Tower or the ostracization of widows, and it does play out in the novel as well. So I think there is something to sort of compare there.
I didn't mean to suggest that, my book is, obviously deals with this woman who's put through this, she's really made to, I mean, I really put her through the ringer in this kind of in the story. So, and gender plays an important part of her, you know, what she experiences. But what I meant to say was that while there are many differences in how man and woman encounter the world, there are certain things that are similar. And you know, I don't think that it's insurmountable. That it's something that a man cannot do as a writer. I think that it was a huge challenge, but it was something that I enjoyed doing, and maybe I'll do it again. I don't know.
I think that's an ongoing debate that can
Yeah, no, I mean, I think men can write female characters, mate, knock yourself out, but just do it well.
Yeah, I know. I think that's the time.
Okay, I'm going to move on from the gender question and talk about language. It's also a particular interest of mine, but also it is a really interesting trend in Indian English writing. And I think both of you represent that trend where you move into a very comfortable Indian English. And I read a review by Deborah Smith of your novel where she talks about the language, and she says she really liked reading the pleasingly unitalicized Hindi in the novel. And you do that as well, and I'm wondering if it's a result of the non-fiction writing that you both have done before, but it's very comfortable in its cultural setting. It's a very easy language to read, it's very easy to understand, and very, very different from older Indian English writing. So I don't know if this was deliberate, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely deliberate. I think for me, the aesthetics of how the book gets presented are political, and it's very important to me to start to undo some of those exoticizations of language that have been present in the presentation of the books that we've been reading, you know, until maybe the 2000s. Indian writers writing in English where the Hindi is italicized, so it looks
provided with a
different.
glossary or
yeah,
something.
There's a glossary in the back, or you know, because the English reader or the non-Hindi speaking or the Urdu speaking or whoever it is, the non-vernacular reader needs to understand, or somehow you have to make that clear in the text. And just that little italicization says so much about how we see the other. I didn't want to do that with this book because it's told from an interior perspective of each of these 5 characters, and when they use language and they're all bilingual, they aren't thinking, oh, this is a special moment that I'm using the word chai, and then I have to explain it's a cup of tea to this person who also knows what chai means. I mean, it just doesn't work anymore for me, and I think that, you know, when you read contemporary fiction that's written in different languages, some of the language in the novel is actually just made up, but you know, it has to become equal. There has to be an equality in the aesthetic. So yeah,
and it flows much better as well, as opposed to stopping and turning the pages. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, exactly what Preeti was saying. I think there's so much exoticization, and I think so much of Indian fiction used to be written for a foreign audience, or you know, you have this kind of imagined readership abroad, and there's, I think, for me, the language of a book really should reflect the society that it's grown in, you know, that the book is about. And you know, a lot of Indian English, a lot of Indian writing in English, you know, you find these novels with these really long and complex names. The characters' names are never something that you hear. You know, I have no friends called, you know, whatever. But Indian writing always has these very complex names and very complex. The language is never something that seemed real and true to me. And so when I started writing, I wanted to write something that was really about, you know, about the society that was the language that people spoke around me, and the language that people, you know, the way we talk to each other. And I think that's what I set out to do.
No, I think that works really well in both situations. And in fact, I wanted to ask you this because, you know, you name, say, the sector or the council or the wall. Did you at all, you know, consider sort of, because those are not Indianized names at all. Those are very sort of generic Western concepts. So did it sort of, was it deliberate again, or do you think?
No, it wasn't something intentional. I just, you know, it was something that we use those words in India. These are part of our language, you know. It's not a foreign language anymore, English, to describe our society, to describe our world. And words like sector, words like the council, you know, these are, I mean, it's part of our lexicon, I think. You know, we have our own Indian English lexicon, and I think this is part of ours.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, I'm going to move on. We have a few minutes before we move on to questions from the audience. I think the other thing that I wanted to ask both of you, and it's a very clear sort of comparison between the two novels, is like we said, I think in your book also it talks about how wealth creates differences and almost becomes like a caste. And you also talk about how caste shapes cities and urban infrastructure. And I think it is sort of a result of the times that we live in, whether in India or just across the world right now, where things like xenophobia, things like obsession with money are taking over everything. I just wanted to know from both of you, what do you think is the biggest challenge that we are facing right now? It's a broad question, but
I think for me the biggest challenge we're facing right now is environmental. I mean, without a question of a doubt, the scarcity of resources and the way that the social order forces people to fight for those resources, fight each other for those resources, is completely unsustainable. That's really devastating to me.
I'm not really one for political punditry, but I think that if you ask me what the biggest challenge is, I think I've tried to write about that in the book, which is that, this need for us to constantly divide ourselves, within a society, within the world. Everyone is sort of retreating behind bigger and bigger, putting up some kind of wall or putting up some kind of barrier between ourselves, and whether it's borders or, colony gates, whatever it is. And I think that we're reaching a place where it's becoming really, really dangerous to, for me to feel even that I can raise a child in a country like ours, because it's becoming so difficult to imagine what India would be like in 20-25 years if we keep heading down this path.
And I also wanted to know, is there a particular readership that this would be aimed at? Did you have it in mind, or is it not something that you'd consider while writing?
No, I don't think about I of course think about the reader, and I hope that there will be one when I'm writing, but I don't write for a specific reader at all. I couldn't have as much fun as I try to when I'm working. I couldn't be so interested in language and so playful and demand quite a lot of my readers if I thought about, oh no, because once you start thinking about the reader, then you suddenly think, who are they? What is their social world like? What are their restrictions? And that just restricts me. Just put it on the page. Do the things you want to do. I think the novel has that capacity.
Yeah, I think you're trying to please yourself more than anyone else, right? It's like an internal reader, because I think we're our own harsh, at least I am a pretty harsh critic of my own writing, and I want to, you write something until you're happy with it, and then if other people are happy with it, fantastic, but if they're not, then you can't really do anything about that.
And is there, are you both working on something, after this brilliant debut? Is it too exhausting just now, or is there a second book that we can look forward to from the both of you?
I hope so. I'm gonna start working on something, but it's really early. It took me so long to write this novel, and it's so exhausting that I don't know.
Process even after.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. It took a long time to, not just to write the book, but to get it published. And they're two very different things, two different parts of a process. So the writing part happens with joy and fear, but that's personal. And then the kind of trying to get published part happens with sort of screams into voids. And it can take years. So now that that's done, I'm just really enjoying meeting the readers and seeing how it goes in the world. I'm going to start something new, promise.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for the audience to have questions. Just give your name and keep the question as a short question. There's one hand here at the beginning.
My question is to Prayaag. I think you have portrayed a very disappointed and very depressing view of the divide in India. I've been teaching in Delhi University for last 25 years, and I live in colonies not once but many, and I have not seen that divide at all. I have so many Muslim friends in my colony. I have got so many Muslim students in my college, and we mix up so well, and the divide is lessening day by day. And I think people are becoming more broad-minded. I've got Christians in my family, I've got Muslims in my family, I've got so many, and like me, there are so many families who've got inter-religion marriages, inter-caste marriages, and people are living very, very comfortably. I think the divide is getting less every day. Maybe you have focused so much on the subject of your book that you have concentrated only on the divide, maybe.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a very fair point. this is a piece of fiction, you know. I have non-fiction. This is fiction. I didn't set out to try and show exactly what India is like or anything like that. But it was something that bothered me. It was something that has been part of, it was something that I've been noticing, and I wanted to try and capture what kind of really harmful effects it could have if we allow these segregations to really accentuate, to really shape our society. And I think you're right in that India has been further divided, was maybe worse in the past, but I think these things are kind of cyclical, you know. They seem bad, and then it gets a little better, and then it gets bad again. And I think we seem to be heading towards a place where it's getting more and more difficult again. You know, there was a time when it was, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I imagine, India seemed to be heading towards this kind of secular paradise, or at least that was the narrative that we told about the country. And now it's being pulled back by regressive forces, by a lot of different forces. So we have to, I think my book is kind of trying to examine where that could end up, as opposed to saying that this is where we are or this is where we aren't.
Hello, hi, I'm Shujoy. I don't agree with her, and I'm very grateful that you inform us of the moral choices or political choices that are being made on our behalf. I just wanted to ask a simple question. When you talk about loss of privilege or the direction of humanity, why does it typically take a geographical or spatial form, which is why it's dystopias? Why is there segregation or blocked off parts of cities or walls? Is that the nature of how you criticize the state of society?
I think that's really interesting. I think that a lot of, the way we live, the way we eat, the way who we marry and who we sleep with, these things are very integral to our view of ourselves as citizens. And, it always seems to play out in where we live, how we position I remember going to this place as a reporter many years ago. I went to a small village outside Bodh Gaya. And Bodh Gaya has this real haven of Buddha, and it's this haven of peace, and you have Japanese tourists, and it's really lovely. And then it must have been 10 or 20 minutes outside Bodh Gaya, I went to this Indian village, and I saw, in a very small scale, I saw exactly, everyone had been, it was probably 60 or 70 homes in that village, but it was all so sharply segregated. There was a Muslim area, there was a poor Muslim area, there was a rich Muslim area, there was this caste area, like high caste people lived here, the Thakurs lived there, and and to me, as an outsider, as a city dweller, all those houses looked kind of the same. It was a very poor village, and all those houses kind of looked the same. But the villagers themselves were so aware of all those distinctions. Of that the huts were of different sizes, and it really made it really hit home for me that you have this in cities, you have this in villages, and it kind of sort of the divisions that we live with kind of really show up in how we, the divisions that sort of, internal divisions kind of really show up in how we live. That's what I try to capture in the book.
Hi, I'm Shrila. My question is a general one. Either of you can answer it. So when we were talking about how men writing about from a female narrative or females writing about from a male narrative, why is it that there's like some male authors, like such as Khaled Hosseini, I really like how he captures the female narrative, and you feel like while reading the book, you feel like it is a female writing it, but like sometimes you'll read it by a male author writing about females, and you're like, wait, like he just doesn't get it. This is not how it is. This is not how I feel. Why do you think the difference comes from, and how can authors try to just sort of check on themselves about whether they're able to capture a narrative properly when it's an opposite gender?
I think I've understood your question. How can you write from a different perspective?
I think what she's saying is how come it varies? So there are some male authors who...
Another gender. Okay. I think it's a question of aesthetics. I think, you can choose certain things like point of view, narrative distance. Some writers decide to tell their stories from the interior of a character and the first person, that's fine. if you're doing that and you're doing it in a different gender or a different class or caste, then you're walking on pretty thin ice, I think, and you have to really get that right and make it as true to that character in that social world as you possibly can. Because of course your fictional character isn't going to speak to all women everywhere. We're all, similar but different. But you have to get it right for the world that you're in. In my book, the section that I read to you where Jeet, this very rich guy, goes to the basti, it was really important for me not to try to kind of evoke the lives of the people that he meets, except through his eyes. So I can talk about them through his own qualified experience, because that's more similar to my experience as a writer. And if I had wanted to do that aesthetically in a different way, I might have even just given that chapter over to somebody else to write, who had more interiority of experience to that. I think that's the way that writers can navigate those things.
I think this is an important rule of writing, is to write what you know. And, if you're writing in a female voice or you're writing in a male voice, you want to, you stick to the things that you can actually understand, you feel like you can capture. Instead of, I couldn't have written a novel with a female character and talked about, I don't know, certain experiences of being a woman, but there are other things and my book is very political, and it's, so I try to stay focused on the things that I could try and capture, and there are many things that I couldn't try and capture about being a woman, and I was lucky to have a good editor. I was lucky to have, kind of internal editor also who stayed away from that kind of thing. There's certain aspects of womanhood that I would never be able to write about, and so I just stayed away from that. And I think, it's something that you have to navigate and think constantly. You have to be really aware of what you actually are capable of writing and what you aren't.
And I do think male writers writing as women are more under scrutiny as opposed to the other way around, because there is a historical context to it, and we do judge them more harshly, but I think it is something to think about, and it is.
Hi. Sorry. This is a question on just adaptations in general, Preeti. So with King Lear, and I think I read somewhere that you obviously have read Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres, and then also there's the Hogarth Press project going on with Dunbar that's come out by, I forget the author's name, but they've got a series of Shakespearean adaptations as well, and Dunbar is the King Lear adaptation. So I'm just curious how, where you see what you've written with We That Are Young sitting alongside these two, not recent, well, A Thousand Acres isn't recent, but the other one is recent, yeah.
Thanks, that's a great question. I love A Thousand Acres as a novel, and I think it's really groundbreaking. It's told from the perspective of the Goneril character, who the section that I read to you is told from that as well. And I'm going to give you a little insider knowledge, which I don't really talk about very often, but this book is intertextual with a lot of things that are more than Shakespeare. So when she talks about the building that her company office is set in, she calls it her gleaming obsidian shard. And that is directly taken from Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres, because for Ginny in A Thousand Acres, that gleaming obsidian shard is what she's inherited, the evil darkness that she's inherited from her own father. And that's kind of my way of playing with this idea of adaptation and paying tribute to some of the writers whose footsteps I'm working in. The Hogarth Press series is an interesting one. It's been called in the Western media as a sort of commemorative project. So they've got these big name writers who are all wonderful doing their own Shakespeare adaptations, and my work doesn't fit in that genre at all. So, thanks.
Hi, and thanks all of you. I have a copy of We That Are Young. I'm going to own a copy of Leila in about 10 minutes' time. The reviews I've seen of both of these books, however, are really different in how they describe your books, and I'm wondering if that's in part because they're both debut novels, so there's not like a template to work off of. Nevertheless, my question is, at this stage in your careers as novelists, what do you do with reviews? Do you ignore them altogether? What do you do if reviews really anger you? Do you learn from reviews? Do you feel pigeonholed by reviews?
I was quite lucky. My book was reviewed very well, and I think that, and I've worked as a reviewer also, so I think it's an important discipline. I think it's really important because it creates a kind of, it gives you a lot of reviews give you a lot of insight into how your book is being read, and that's really important, because, I think at some point you also can't pay as much, you can't give a reviewer, like, you can. I mean, I'm trying to think of how much attention you should give a reviewer, and it's important. I think it's an important discipline, and it's important to have that discussion around a book, because it really it gives you new ways of looking at your own work. So, I mean, I quite enjoyed it, but I'm sure if I had a bunch of very angry reviews, I would have given you a completely different answer.
I've had some really fascinating experiences with this, because when you write on your own in your room for so long, you just put so much of your love into your own work, and then suddenly you become this very external thing that everyone owns it, everyone has a say. So just to take some of your questions backwards, that you asked about being pigeonholed. So because the book's been reviewed in England and in India, the differences are really interesting to me, what people write about. So on the one hand, in England, we've got Shakespeare, and on the other hand, we've got India, and I'm sort of stuck between these two things, and people are like, how do you know Shakespeare in England? I went to school. How do you know India? Well, my parents are from here, and I completely traverse both those worlds. So, I'm getting it from both sides, but in a way, that's really what the book is about. It's about how we can all contain many universes. When I've got a bit more perspective on all of this, and I have to admit, I did stop reading the reviews for a while, because it was literally making me so angry, I just had to stop. And lots of friends who are writers much more experienced than me told me not to read them, except for the good ones. And I think I'm going to go back over them and when I start the next thing and take some stuff on board. Why not?
I think we can do a last question.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful session. My question is to both of you. As Prayaag, being someone who faces this issue firsthand, and you are a human rights activist, so even you can help me with this. There's a lot of Islamophobia around, and people, so I had two very weird encounters in Jaipur itself, where the cab drivers told me, no, don't go that side, there are a lot of Muslims there. And I have a lot of Muslim friends, and I adore them, love them actually. And as a person, I can't actually debate with the cab driver, because he's been conditioned for so long to believe something that he has his faith into. But how can we, on like an everyday basis, help with this issue? And how can we make a small difference in what people think?
Write a book. And then go and teach somewhere. There's no higher calling, I think.
It's funny what you said about the cab drivers, because I don't have many of the visible, I mean, maybe the beard is kind of Muslim, I don't know, but, I don't wear a skull cap or any of that, so oftentimes many people don't see me as a Muslim if they don't know my name, and my first name is not Muslim, it's Prayaag. So I've had this experience many times where people, people say, oh, that's a Muslim neighborhood, or, those are all Muslim, or they'll say something political, and they'll be like, oh, these bloody Muslims are ruining the country, or something like that. So you kind of encounter these things, and I don't know how you can change it. That's a huge question, I don't know how you can change something like this. These are very deeply ingrained attitudes, and, that are shaped by that person's entire life and various experiences he or she has had. But I think the way to do it is on a very human level. As you said, you have friends, you reach out in your own life to as many people as possible who you feel like, and I think that is the only thing we can do. We can write about it, teach about it, and just make a difference in your own life, and hopefully that if enough people do it, we can head to a place that's a little bit better than we are right now.
Thank you. We'll wrap up the session now. Thank you so much, Prayaag. Thank you so much, Preti, for being here. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you, and thank you for all the great questions. And I hope everyone's going to go and pick up both the books now. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you, Mohini.